Hello there and good evening. Welcome to the Chautauqua Visual Arts Lecture Series. We are here on this Tuesday evening, now going beyond our summer season at Chautauqua to now having this lecture series once a month on the second Tuesday of every month. And so as we now expand our lecture series year round, I'm so excited to have Sheetal Prajapati here with us this evening. I'm so thrilled that you will be able to hear and as well as myself get to know her through her presentation, and then after which a question and answer period with her. So Sheetal is an educator, she's an artist, and an advisor working across many fields, including the field of art and public engagement. So she was born in Buffalo, New York, and she is a first generation Indian American. Before moving to New York in 2010, she studied, lived, and worked in Chicago for 12 years after growing up in Kentucky. Wow, that's a lot of different places. Can't wait to hear more about that. I hope she'll touch upon a little bit of her history here. So Sheetal is currently on faculty at School of Visual Arts in New York City in the MFA Fine Arts program there. And she works as an advisor and consultant in the field through her agency, Lohar Projects. And in 2020, this year, she signed with Serendipity Literary Agency, which is in New York City, and is currently working on her first children's book and nonfiction memoir. Now, over the years, I first met Sheetal at Haystack, which is Haystack Mountain School of Craft, which we were both there as guest speakers. And at the time, she was also the assistant director of learning and arts initiatives at the Museum of Modern Art. And then I saw her again when she was the director of public engagement at Pioneer Works in Red Hook, Brooklyn, where she served until 2018. She also served previous to those appointments as the Director of Education Programs at the Mary Leigh Block Museum of Art at Northwestern University in Chicago. And prior to that at MoCA Chicago from 2004 to 2007, where she redeveloped the Family and Youth Programs Division. So it's just quite extraordinary how much experience she's had in arts education, which I believe is so crucial. And I'm thrilled that she's a practicing artist, able to do this work wearing multiple hats, as many of the people that we bring to you do. She's also held a lot of residencies in addition to the Haystack Mountain School of Art at Elizabeth Foundation for the Arts in New York City, Wasaic Project, and Poco, and I'm hoping I pronounced that correctly, among other things, other places. In 2019, she was the nominee for the Emerging Artist Award, through Rima Hort Mann Foundation in New York. And so without further ado, I bring you Sheetal Prajapati, and I'm so excited that she's here with us this evening. Sheetal, would you like to come on? And then I'm so excited to see you afterwards for a wonderful conversation and to welcome everybody's questions. Welcome and thank you for being here.
Thank you, Sharon. It's really nice to be here, and thanks to the entire team at Chautauqua who's made it really easy for me to get set up here, and everybody who's online listening. I really appreciate your audience today. So I think I'm going to get this PowerPoint started. All right. So when Sharon asked me to give a talk for the art school, I was excited, but also pretty overwhelmed trying to figure out what to talk about. There are so many things to talk about, but in some ways it also feels like we need to talk about the things that matter right now. And I was thinking a lot about the last 6 months and how I've been operating professionally and personally and creatively during that time. And I started to really think about this idea of life and work blending, and the ways that this pandemic and the ways that all of the protests that we're seeing around the country and around the world have really muddled that line in a way where it really doesn't exist for many of us, especially for those of us who work in the arts. It seems often like the work we do is rooted in some kind of passion and something that we care about that goes beyond making and beyond sharing our ideas, but something that's about expressing who we are and putting that out into the world. And that takes risk and that takes courage. But I think at a time like this, it also feels really necessary. So the talk that I'm sharing with you guys tonight, I am calling Everything is Life, because I feel like this has been a time that has really made it clear to me how important those distinctions how important it is that those distinctions can actually be detrimental to our progress creatively and really as a community. So first, I wanted to share a little bit about my life. So this is my apartment. This is one view. I do a lot of work at that desk, and I'm actually sitting at it right now. And this is the other side of my apartment. This is my family room. I do a lot of work on that couch as well. And I thought it was important to share this because all of us are living in our own bubbles right now. And although our spaces that we've lived in might be familiar to us, it feels like they've taken on new meaning in a lot of ways. Definitely for me. This is what my work life looks like. It's a series of Zoom meetings, teaching, meeting with groups of people, meeting with people one-on-one, doing studio visits. All of it lives in this box. And I feel like it's important for us to kind of see that and know that all of us are doing this at the same time. And then finally, this is my social life. These are my friends that on one side, you see me interacting with groups of them online on an app called House Party. And on the other side, you see an image of me in real life with two of my friends in a park. It's one of the only kinds of places that I've been able to see people in real life. And you'll notice that both of them are wearing masks, as am I when I took this picture. And I just wanted to share a visual of this reality because it can feel really lonely. When you're kind of moving in these spaces, always having to be conscious of how physically close you are to other people or being really conscious of how separate you are from them. And I think all of those things affects the way we move around in the world. And it's been 5-6 months of this now. And I think in some ways we've adopted some of those behaviors into kind of how we approach everything that we're doing right now. And so I hope some of these images you can relate to. So people always ask me what I do, and I am always challenged by trying to give them a short answer. And so I think about 4 or 5 years ago, I just stopped trying to give them a short answer. And in the context of this talk, I was looking at some of these definitions that I had written for presentations in the past and thinking about how they apply not just to my creative and professional work, but to my actual life. And the second part of the text that you see on the screen right now, I think has been something that has spoken to me in a different way now than it has in the past, which is this idea of exploring circumstances of intimacy transformation through the lens of examining myself. And if nothing else, I think we can all agree that the pandemic has forced all of us to look deeply at who we are and how we spend our time and who we spend it with. And I think a lot of that mental work has been channeled into the professional work that I'm doing right now, which I'll talk about in a little bit. This definition of what I do and who I am also very much relates to starting my own agency following working in institutions for 15 years, which Sharon mentioned some of the places that I've worked at. When I think about defining what I do, I think about it in 3 specific modes of being or modes of moving around the world. One of them is art, and I think about that as the practice of expression. And in this particular time, the making of life. Everything that I put together, every email I write, the way that I walk down the street, the music that I listen to, all of these things are creating a new set of circumstances for myself, but also the people around me, because we can't behave the way that we were behaving before. And all of us, I think, in some ways are taking really creative approaches to how we make that happen. Education and pedagogy is another big tenet of what I do, and in some ways a lot of who I am. Sharon had mentioned that I have a long career in art education and museum education specifically. And the root of that is a really core belief that creativity is an essential human trait and should be developed and nurtured the same way all other essential skills of living are. And to me, that's about learning how to live our life and actually learning how to move through it. And finally, and I think this relates, in some ways more to my professional work, but it applies here in a lot of different ways too, which is public engagement and this idea of connecting and thinking about the way that we move through the world as a series of journeys of connecting with other people, temporarily, long-term, in groups, in pairs. I think those are the things we've understood make life meaningful in a specific way, especially right now. So as I was thinking about putting this together, I was also thinking about the questions that I've been asking myself, not just in the last month, but really for the last 5 months. And I've been thinking a lot about the pandemic and the series but really a global reckoning. And I recently was writing a piece for a residency program that I was part of last year. And one of the things I was writing about was the unique circumstance we find ourselves in right now, which is for the first time in, probably 100 years or more, we as a global society are experiencing one thing together. And it manifests in so many different ways in our daily lives and from region to region. But this pandemic has destroyed our sense of nationhood, boundaries. All of those things are invisible to this. And that is really interesting starting point for me to think about what this year has shown us. I think it's also forced us to think about who we are. And I think that has a relationship to the kind of resistance and the action that we're seeing around the United States and seeing allies across the world joining in this fight, joining our voices and supporting what is happening here in the United States, saying to our government, but also saying at a global level that we may have a set of universal values around how we treat each other that are important for all of us to support no matter where we live. And this question of grief is also something I've been thinking about a lot too. Me, like many other people, have sustained a range of different losses, personal, professional, during this pandemic. And as well off as some of us may be still now, many people are suffering. And I think that recognition that we are living amongst and with people that are in grief forces us to kind of deal with that grief too, even if we're maybe feeling okay on a day-to-day basis. And I think that is a practice that we've all kind of come to, kind of understanding and accepting the fact that we are living in a time of crisis, and that is not a temporary moment. And there is a really long road ahead of us to get where we want to be. So part of that is sustaining ourselves in this trauma, sustaining ourselves in this grief. And finally, of course, at a most simple level, what actually matters right now? What do we care about? And how do we enact that in the things that we're doing? Being kind of stripped down to kind of the bare minimum in terms of how we live and what we can do. I think that question for me continues to ring throughout the year, but I feel like it's something I'm going to keep holding on to. And we'll come back to this slide towards the end of the presentation as well. So these questions, what did they lead me to doing? I'm going to talk a little bit about my art practice, and I'm going to talk a little bit about my professional practice as a consultant in the field. We're going to start with my creative practice. So when the pandemic started in March, I live alone in my apartment and immediately kind of had this sense of dread of what is it going to be like not to see other people? And in that fear, I started to think about, well, if I feel this way, what is it like for other people too? What is it like to live with a partner that you might not be getting along with? What is it to live with children who need a lot from you and you can't take care of yourself? There are all kinds of circumstances. And I started to recognize that I'm actually in a space where I might have the capability to offer something. And so without really thinking about it, I sent a few people cards, some of my friends who I knew that were having a hard time, and kind of casually posted something on my Instagram saying, hey, are you feeling a little lonely? Do you want me to send you a card? Send me your mailing address. I'll do it. Not really thinking very much of it. And immediately people started responding to me, sending me their address. At first it was friends, and then it started to become friends of friends and people that I just absolutely had never met and had no connection to. And about 2 or 3 weeks into kind of starting to receive these addresses, I had somebody message me and say, hey, this is a really nice thing that you're doing. I'd love to receive a card, but if you have time, could you also write to my friend? She's stuck in this country away from her family, and I know it would just make her day to know that someone's thinking about her. And I did that and became really clear that that's also something I could offer to people. So from about March to May, I sent 70 cards. I sent them all over the world. Like I said, I sent them to some people that I knew, but about 55 of these requests were from people that were secondarily related to me or someone that I didn't know at all. And there's something very beautiful about that. And for me, it became a really important daily ritual. As you can see in this image here, even I have Post-it notes saying what day of the week I'm going to send these. And it became part of my routine. The cards that I was sending are cards that I get made online, and they all have images that I posted on Instagram. And I've been using blank cards like this for years and years and years. And so when I started getting a lot of requests, I made a new set. That was mostly pieces of artwork or murals that I had seen. This particular image is from the wall of a residency program that I attended last fall at the Strange Foundation in upstate New York. The residency director had actually painted one of the walls this really beautiful abstract design, and it was something that I saw every single day when I was there. And so I snapped a photo of it, and here's a card that I sent from that image. I started also documenting every single day that I sent cards and keeping count. So the images that you see on your left is an image. I would take one like that every day. And then the image you see on your right are some additional images that I would take to kind of documenting the kinds of cards that I was sending out to people. As the project went on, another thing that I didn't expect to happen started to take shape, which is people started sending me responses. So you see I think the image that might be on your right is a stack of cards that were sent back to me as a response to the card that I had sent. Handmade drawings and watercolors, cards that were customized, envelopes that had stickers and special notes on them. It was actually quite touching to start to receive these notes of care from other people and recognize that through this action that for me was very much about grounding myself in some kind of connection with other people became an exchange between me and some people that I knew really well and others who I got to know a little bit better through this process. And the entire time that I was writing these and doing this work, I was thinking about some of my past artwork, which I will talk about, that is related to writing letters. But I didn't have the same intention going into this. This was, I have to admit, in some ways a little bit selfish on my part because I was really wanting that connection. But because I was posting this on social media, a few of my friends who work at art organizations started to notice. And so in May and in April and May, I got connected with Creative Time and with POW Arts, which is professional arts organizations for women. Creative Time started doing this great thing where they were using their social media account to promote the work that artists were doing around the community to support others during the pandemic. And so they were featuring individual projects each week and featured mine sometime at the beginning of April. And during that time, I got kind of an interesting uptick of people who kind of saw this there and started requesting cards from me. And then a little later on in April, POW Arts is an organization that I have a relationship with. They were trying to rethink their programming. You know, at this time, what is it that we need to give space for? And in talking about my project with them, I facilitated a short conversation, about an hour, using this project as an impetus to talk with a group of people about what intimacy and building intimacy looks like during a pandemic, and especially in April, for those of you who are in New York, you know, it was an extremely intense moment of isolation for many of us. Sometimes I think about this work in and of itself and ask myself, you know, my intention wasn't set out for it to be an art project, or an artwork for that matter. And if I think about it as such, probably the thing that would be the artwork is the exchange I had, the things that were most intangible about it. But I will say that during this period, it was really reassuring to get support from organizations like Creative Time and POW Arts as I was doing this, and helping me understand that even in doing work like this, that's about kind of understanding myself and my relationship to other people, I can still be bringing something into the world that has value, not just for the recipients of these cards, but to start a conversation about other ways to build this kind of connection. So I mentioned that part of my creative practice includes letter writing. And so I'm going to share one project with you, which is actually two works, which is one of the first art projects and artworks that I ever made. And in 2014, I was invited to go to India for 6 weeks to teach at an undergraduate art and design school in Bangalore, India. As Sharon mentioned, I'm Indian American, and this was a really big deal for me. And the only times I had been to India prior to this was with my family, and really only seen the country through the lens of that experience. And I'd never been to Bangalore. I was excited about the idea of engaging with young Indians, because I felt like my understanding of India and the culture of India was very framed in my parents' experience, which was a generation ago. And so as I was preparing to leave for India, I was very aware that I wanted to document my experience there in some intentional way. And I've kept a journal on and off for 20 plus years. And so I knew that writing was going to be part of that. But I really wanted to think about, when I really started thinking about as I was preparing for the trip, all the people that it made it possible for me to be doing something like this. I was working full-time at MoMA during that period. So there were a lot of people that kind of helped me bring this together, both personally and professionally. And about a week before I left, I started thinking about maybe writing letters to people as a way to thank them. And 2 nights before I left, my friends had a small little gathering for me, like a little toast before I left. And at that gathering, about 16 people came. I decided to get everybody's mailing address, and I said, I'm going to send all of you letters. And I got on the plane. I was like, okay, I'm going to write these letters. I'm going to write this journal. Can I write both of these things every day? And I decided to do something totally different, which is make my journal entries letters to these folks. And these folks range from people that I knew quite well to people that I had formal relationships with, but had been kind of some part of the process of me getting to this work. And so the agreement that I made with all of them is that I would write them one journal entry in the form of a letter. And when they received it, they would write me back. But instead of sending me the letter, we would meet in person to talk about both of the letters. And so all the participants lived in New York, people that I could actually meet with in person afterwards. And this is an image of the envelope, of the 16 envelopes that I sent. This is an image of one of the responses that I got. You can see there's text and there's also a drawing here. And then these are images of the actual letters themselves that I wrote. And you can see they're actually torn out of the journal that I brought to write in. And each page has one of my bindis on it, which is the object that I'm wearing right here to mark the day that I wrote the letter before I sent it out. When I returned from India and started meeting with each person to get these responses back, another kind of amazing thing happened, which is people weren't just writing me notes or drawings. They were actually making objects for me. You can see in this image here a tag and a Polaroid photograph. And the tag that you see there is part of a line from the letter that I actually wrote. And then you can see this other collage that a friend of mine made from a series of magazine clippings and drawings that she was working on at the time she received this note. that collection of letters became kind of an archive of my time in India. And when I got back, and initially I thought, okay, I'm going to bind these, I'm going to publish them back into a journal. But the reality was that my letters with these individuals were pretty intimate. And in meeting with them in person, sometimes I would spend 3-4 hours talking to this person, not just about what we wrote, but about a range of other things that kind of emerged from this really interesting letter exchange. And so it became clear that publishing these letters is not really going to serve a purpose in terms of speaking to people about the nature of intimacy and the nature of building intimacy over time, over a spectrum of relationships, and the value that it kind of can have to you as a person. And so I started thinking more seriously about if I wanted to make this into a work that was about exploring that intimacy, what would I do? And so in 2016, I made a game, an art game. And you can see an image of it here. The game was called Closer, and it was a Ouija board-based game wherein two strangers would play this game together, facilitated by me. And over the course of the game, they would receive a prompt to share memories with each other. And the idea being that in being able to share a memory around a singular prompt, two people can find a connection with each other, even in a liminal and temporary space. The deck of cards included the prompts that they would choose from, and all of the prompts on the cards were 2 or 3 word phrases from the series of letters that came from India. And the idea here was to think about using the Ouija board as a way to tap into the connection we have on the spiritual plane that we exist in, as opposed to trying to reach for something that is abstract and outside of us, but to really think about embodying intimacy in the space between us. And so the last part of the engagement of this game was that I would leave the two players alone to share these memories. And I presented this at Denny Gallery in New York, and I had 16 pairings, and people spent anywhere from 5 to 30 minutes speaking with each other on their own without me. And of course, this is a project that, again, I ran into the same challenge of how do you document something like this, right? If I was going to show this work again, besides actually performing it with people, what else could I do? At the end of every conversation, every pair put their thumbprint on one card. And so I have 16 cards from this actual performance of each conversation, and that is how they're documented for archival purposes and for showing maybe down the road. So I'm gonna stop there talking about my art practice. I'm happy to answer questions afterwards as well, but I do want to move on to the consulting work that I'm doing, because I think that the impetus for it, although a lot of that developed over 2018 and 2019 when I actually developed the agency itself, really are being reinforced during this time of COVID and during this time of social and economic resistance that we're seeing. I worked in the field for 15 years, and I worked at amazing institutions that had incredible collections, and I had access to many resources to do programming for all age groups, and I learned a lot during that time, both in Chicago and New York. But over the course of my career, I kept coming back to a series of kind of ongoing frustrations, which is the limits of the system of museums, the limits of a collection, and in some ways the limits of discipline-specific work. And those manifested in a lot of different ways. But I think my time at MoMA was really a starting point for me to think about, okay, these things are frustrating me. Instead of identifying a problem, let me try to identify my values. What is the opposite of this? What are the things that I actually care about? Let's try to go back to that. And in that process, which really started, like I said, at the end of my time at MoMA and took place throughout my entire time at Pioneer Works, was about understanding that for me, art can mean many, many different things. And art can be tangible and intangible. But what makes me passionate about it is the way that it allows us to connect to each other and to the world around us. And I know that sounds really general, but I have experienced it myself, and I've facilitated it happening with groups of people and individuals. And I've witnessed people be able to find themselves in new ways through creative experiences. And so getting down to those set of values made me realize I don't need a collection. I don't need a museum. I don't even think I need an institution. Well, what I need is a space to think about how to support this work with organizations. And it doesn't just have to be one. And I was lucky enough throughout my career to work with audiences of all ages. So I also knew that my work wasn't just about serving a certain type of person or a certain age, but thinking about art and engagement at a more meta human level and really thinking about its relationship to our lives and the way that it can help us move forward in our thinking, and it can help us connect with things that actually matter to us. And so that's what Lohar Projects was born from. And I'm going to share 2 projects that I've worked on since I started this agency. And I think it's important for me to say that, you know, in all of this thinking about starting this organization and working independently, a big part of it was being able to put myself in a space where I could share my values with the field, and to put myself in a space where I could choose the artists and the artworks and the organizations that I felt like were doing work that mattered. And I think many organizations are doing that. But for me, it became really clear that if I'm going to work in public engagement and I'm going to work in education and pedagogy, I need to be thinking about impact in a different way. And so that's where Lohar Projects really started. And just as a note, Lohar is my mother's maiden name and is kind of a nod to that side of my family and to all of the entrepreneurs that kind of came from my grandfather to some of my uncles. And my mom, I often think of her as an entrepreneur for coming to this country and starting a new life with my father in totally foreign land. So one of the projects I've been working on since last summer is a project called Stotenema, and it is a 15-year-old artist project by an artist named Aida Stehovic. And Aida is an artist who was born in Bosnia, and she was part of a community of Bosnian Muslims who were heavily oppressed in Bosnia and the region throughout the century. And in 1995, they experienced a mass genocide of 8,000 plus men and boys in their community. Aida and her family escaped Bosnia and came to the United States as refugees. And Aida's arts practice has been very focused on exploring her experience of this trauma, but also understanding how, as a community of people, we continue to educate people about this atrocity and also help people heal. So this is a temporary monument she's been doing for 15 years. And this year marked not only the 15th anniversary of the project itself, but the 25th anniversary of the actual genocide. And Aida was invited to Bosnia to present this project this year to commemorate that anniversary. And as part of this temporary monument, which is the image you see in front of you, we also decided to work on a feature film to talk about genocide at large, and also the way projects like this help move the conversation forward around healing and around prevention, and to do a series of exhibitions in the region as well, showcasing some of the work that came out of these larger performative projects. And so I came on as an executive producer for this project, and I've been working with Aida and a small team of people on everything from fundraising to public programming to writing contracts, really a catch-all in a lot of ways. But this project for me, besides kind of the many ways it speaks to the things that matter, that should matter to us, it was also a space for me to exercise a whole variety of skills that I've picked up along the way in my career. And so working with an artist and supporting their vision and also helping expand and explore that in new ways was a key element to both my interest in working on this and kind of the ability for me to use a variety of skills to support the project in whatever way it needs to be supported. And here's another close-up of these cups. The performance itself was a series of cups that was filled with coffee and laid on the ground over the course of one day to create a nomadic monument and a temporary monument that was then picked up and carried away, and cups restored to do it again the next year. And then one of the first clients that I started working with when Lohar Projects began was Times Square Alliance. And Times Square Alliance is a business improvement district. It's an organization that supports the safety and the support of all of the businesses and people in Times Square. So the Alliance oversees the security team. It oversees the sanitation team. There are 24-hour staff that keep Times Square beautiful at all times and safe for all of us. They also have a programming leg and an arts program. And in fall of 2019, they hosted the debut of Kehinde Wiley's Rumors of War, which was a 27-foot monument. Here you see it in Times Square lit up at night, that featured a young Black man astride a horse in a very heroic stance. The figure on the horse is wearing jeans and a hoodie and Nike tennis shoes. And this is all very important. This sculpture in and of itself was fashioned after a Confederate monument in Richmond, Virginia, that Kehinde Wiley experienced when he had an exhibition of his paintings there at the Virginia Museum of Fine Arts. He saw a Confederate statue of General Jeb Stuart that was along Monument Avenue in Richmond and immediately felt the need to respond to that. And so when he returned from Virginia, this was in 2016, he started conceptualizing this. And this particular monument is fashioned directly after the Jeb Stuart monument, with the main difference being that Jeb Stuart is not on top of the horse, but rather a young Black man from our time. And so just from describing this work, you can imagine the opportunity and the complex nature of a work like this in Times Square. And following its debut in Times Square, it was purchased by the Virginia Museum of Fine Arts and is now publicly displayed in Richmond, Virginia, outside of the museum. And so going into this project, I was invited to come help develop the public engagement and think about, how do you talk to millions of strangers about Kehinde Wiley and Rumors of War in Times Square? During my time there, I worked with the sanitation and security staff actually to understand the nature of people's behavior in the plaza and understand what they're looking for and how they move around the space. And through a series of conversations and some firsthand research, we developed two main projects during the course of the installation of the sculpture. One was a team of public art ambassadors, and those were what you might call docents. There were a group of about 8 people, some from the security staff at Times Square Alliance, some from the sanitation team at the Alliance, and then a group of outside hires that were educators, artists, and young people who were interested in working in the arts. We worked with organizations like Recess Art and Studio Museum to recruit a set of individuals who had not necessarily deep knowledge about the arts, but enthusiasm about the impact the arts could have. So people that had worked with the arts in a way that was related to possibly social justice or social impact in some way. And I worked with this group of ambassadors. I trained them, and they were deployed out on our plaza to talk with strangers over the course of 3 months about this work. And they talked to about 3,000 people from all over the world. And we're able to have really deep conversations, not just about what the sculpture was, but about the character and nature of our own history. The second part of the project is what you see here in front of you, which is a response wall and a way for people who were feeling more reflective or maybe a little shy to respond to the work in and of itself. And as you can see here, we had a question posted every week. In this case, it was, why do monuments matter? Allowing people to think more broadly, not just about Kehinde's work, but about what monuments mean to us at large and why we should care about where they're located, and who they are celebrating. And finally, I'm going to talk just a little bit about some of the work I do with individual artists. So I've done things like resume review, portfolio review services for artists, and do that still. But one of the more exciting things that I love to do with artists is working on their story or their narrative. And in this particular case, I was working with an artist. Her name is Goldie Poblador. And Goldie and I met at a residency at Wasaic Project. And at the time, she works in glass, and she makes hand-torched, handmade glass objects. And you can see two of those creations here in this image. And here's another image of a series that she did that was related to making these beautiful handmade glass sculptures that were vessels that had a relationship to different mythologies around feminism and femaleness in her culture. And so as she was making these objects, she realized that there was retail value, that these were series of objects that people could actually use. But she didn't know how to talk about her artwork as objects to sell. And so I worked with her over the course of a few months, and we developed a narrative together for her to sell her work and talk about selling her work in a way that still did justice to the impetus and the kind of the groundwork and research of these objects in and of themselves. So I'm gonna kind of end this conversation, or at least my part of talking, with thinking a little bit about this larger question, which is what is engagement during the pandemic? And I go back to what I was talking about at the beginning, which is, what really matters now. And so if we think about what constitutes work that matters, what constitutes engagement that matters, and what's even possible right now. And for me, on a personal level, I think there's lots of ways we all explore that with our loved ones that makes sense for us. But I'm really thinking about this on a professional level too, because so much of my work was about creating spaces for people to be together, creating spaces for people to be together with art. All of a sudden, that became largely impossible. And at least for me, I became kind of concerned about for me, it's important to stay engaged and to be continuing to support the work of artists and support the work of bringing publics together. And how can I do that? And I'm going to share kind of this next slide with you, which is going to have a lot of information on it. But the kind of the impetus for sharing with you is to kind of articulate the way that I was rethinking some of this work that I've been doing for a long time in many capacities. So, I teach at SVA, as was mentioned. I'm working on a writing project, which I will talk about in just a little bit. But there's also a series of other hats and spaces that I occupy: mentorship, residencies, serving as a guest critic, speaking to you guys now, joining the board of a great organization called Art and Feminism, and working with organizations like the Shed and the Joyce Foundation to support their grant programs and giving money to artists and projects that are relevant to what's happening now. And I think prior to this pandemic, a lot of this stuff, I don't want to say is secondary because I absolutely don't believe that, but was tangential in some ways to the core of the work I was doing, which in this case for the past 2 years has been consulting with large organizations. But during the pandemic, a lot of the bigger projects that I had were get put on hold. They were paused. And these activities, these kinds of engagements with the field kind of rose to the surface in a different way. And I started to realize that even though many of these things, except with the exception of teaching, of course, aren't about directly engaging with publics, they're about helping make spaces to do so. They're about helping make spaces for artists to do the creative work that they need to right now. And it was really, I have to say, refreshing for me to rethink this work and to really understand it as part of my practice as not just a professional, but as a person. These are things that I care about on a personal level. These are not things that are necessarily related to monetary compensation. Sometimes yes, but looking at this list, most of it is no. But all of these things, yeah, they feed my professional career, but they feed me too. And during the pandemic, they became some of the most important kinds of activities I did, not to just feel like I was able to contribute to the field, but to realize that these are spaces that I can contribute in different ways. And for me personally, as a human, that's really satisfying. And I share this because I think it kind of speaks again to the way that I'm starting to think about everything I do, from the way that I spend time with my best friends, to the kinds of relationships I have, to this work, and the way that the intersection of them during this time is an opportunity to rethink what they mean to you, or in this case, what they mean to me. And so we'll go back to this first slide. And I certainly don't have all the answers for you or for me, but these are questions I've been thinking about for quite some time. So I offer, what I'm offering to you all is some possibilities. And, thinking about breaking things is something that feels in some ways really sad, and destruction feels like a path of maybe darkness or kind of chaos. But I also like to think about the need to break the systems that we have created for ourselves today. And part of that starts with acknowledging that we have been breaking things for a long time. The systems we created, we're breaking our ability to connect to each other. We're breaking our ability other as companions and as comrades in the way that we live our lives. And those require more than a rethinking, but a kind of healing, as well as a reshaping. And so I use the word breaking to emphasize really what I think is the process, the opposite and responsive process to that, which is healing together. And who are we? I think one thing that we all can say very clearly is that we are changing individually and collectively, and we don't have any choice but to do so right now. And I like to think about that as a space for possibility, and not as a space of just purely tension. And yes, for some of us, we're being pushed into uncomfortable places. For others, like myself, I'm finally seeing voices for a lot of my experiences in public spaces. And though it's really jarring, it's also helping me see my experience in this world and in this country in a new way. And I think that's really exciting. I found that even in these 6 months, I'm changing again. Things that I believe and things that I hold on to, even the way that I practice them in the world has started to shift. And I think for many of us, especially for those of us who live in New York and live very busy lives, starting to think about the relationship between how we spend our time and who we are, which I think is a really big question for many of us. And how do we live and sustain grief? And simply put, together. And I think that it relates to the first two questions that I'm posing as well, which is, none of this is possible unless we are in it as a community of people, whether that is a community of 2 or a community of 2 million. We are social beings by nature. And I think that this pandemic and the Black Lives Matter movement, but also the larger global movement around things like fascism and genocide and racism and sexism, these things we have to heal together to move forward for them together. And so I think for me, it's very simple. The answer is very simple, but the practice is a lot harder than I think we can imagine sometimes. And finally, what matters? And I guess it's kind of cheesy to say love, but I do think that we're at a moment right now where we kind of have to recognize that the kinds of intimacies that we have are things that hopefully we can rely on, and that building those over time are the things that can hold us even in chaotic moments. And I know that everyone doesn't always have the same access to that with the people in their lives, but I do think it's important for those of us who recognize it and see it to not only maintain it and nourish it in our lives, but find ways for other people to engage with that as well. And so I was going to do a reading, but I think I might actually just stop here and maybe open the floor to questions. So I think I'm going to do that instead, unless there's, a real desire for me to read to you guys. I was going to read a little bit from the memoir that I'm working on right now, that I've been working on for about 1.5 years. But I feel like I've also shared a lot about my personal narrative through the talk. So I'm going to stop here, and maybe Sharon, you have an opinion about this.
Hi. I don't have any opinion. My opinion most of all would be that I would love to hear so much more, because you've got me so excited by everything that you have shared. And so entirely up to you. If you want to be able to read something, a short or however long you'd like, it's entirely up to you. That's not really an opinion, but I'm just excited to hear whatever you'd like to do. And if you'd like to not read, we will be happy to go right into Q&A.
I think let's just go into Q&A. I feel like there's a lot, hopefully there's a few questions that people have. So we'll start with that.
Okay, so thank you. So just to go over for everybody how the Q&A works here. Right next to your name, and this is where my camera is here, but so probably to the right of your name, there's a little camera sign. And what you could do is click onto that, and that will turn green with a red question mark next to it. And you can, that'll alert me that you have a question. And then we'll bring you up onto the screen as soon as we can. We'll put it in queue. Or you can just ask a question here on the in the chat, and then I will repeat that question to Sheetal, and then we will go from there. So entirely up to you. And I think, Chip, if you want to bring us up on the screen, that would be amazing. Oh my gosh, I have so many questions for you. I am so excited. Some of the things, in the chat, I kept saying things like, yes, awesome. Some of the things that you were saying really motivated me by of course, ending by saying love is really important. And I actually don't think that it's a corny thing. I think beauty and love are underrated. And the fact that we can talk about those things too shows our vulnerability, yielding to that strength, and transparency through that as well, and trust. I guess one of the questions I wanted to ask you in the most enthusiastic way, and I'm spitting all over my computer here just because I'm beaming with excitement and enthusiasm, is how do you trust the projects that you want to commit to and the people that you want to have in your community? What is it about the criteria that you're looking for within yourself? And I'm just thinking about a lot of the artists who are have been listening and watching your presentation, to give them some kind of guidelines, because sometimes it can be really painful and hard to share that love and expose ourselves so much. And I'm not only talking about the organizations that clearly you share a value with, because I think perhaps you may not be working with them otherwise, but what about the artists too that you choose to work with? How do you choose your community?
Sure. I think that's a really good question. And I think for me, it's happened both organically and intentionally. I think at least from the perspective of Low Heart Projects, I certainly think about both the organization and the artist, how they are aligned together in terms of an organization that's supporting a certain kind of work, or a certain kind of artist. That relationship is really important to me too. But I think at a more basic level, for about one of the best educations I got during my career has been co-organizing a conference called Open Engagement. And Open Engagement was a conference that was about art and social practice. And during the 3 years of co-organizing that, I learned a lot about the various ways art can have an impact amongst groups of people. And so I think, and it seems really generic, but at a really basic level, I think a lot about impact and about my role in magnifying that impact. And recognizing that there are projects and there are artists and there are works where that public engagement aspect can really do something for the work that maybe nothing else can, and I believe that. And so for me, it is about that relationship between, what is it that I can bring to this? Because as much as I have in my career conceived of my own projects, make my own artwork, as a professional, I think the thing that I'm most interested in is kind of facilitating and supporting the work of artists at every stage in their career. So I know that's not a direct answer, but those are some of the things that I think about.
So great. Thank you for that. And that was a hard question and very general, but I just love how you ended just with the word love is extraordinary. A couple of comments in our chat right now. We have Michael Fernandez, who's an amazing artist who's currently resides in Miami. And he was one of 38 participants of our residency program this past season, and now an alumnus of our program. And he just wrote and said, I just wanted to thank you for this beautiful talk, and that the projects you began with really connect with the print project I'm currently working on as a result of my time at Chautauqua Visual Arts, and would really like to reach out and send you a print. Oh, that's so nice. Okay. Well, I'm sure that part of this is too is how do we break the privilege of, accessibility is privilege. And part of the work that we're doing at Chautauqua is sort of crushing that to be able to open many doors as possible. How can people reach you in such a way where, let's say, he wants to reach out and send something to you?
Sure. My last slide had information on it, just at a practical level. But also, if you go to either one of my websites, my email is on there. So you can definitely reach me. And also, Sharon, I'm happy for you to share my contact information with the participants today if you'd like. I'm very open and always happy to have conversations with new people. So,
well, thank you. I will then copy you on that so that you know who these people are. Now, someone in the chat was asking, Ellie Balk is saying, how do you see public engagement pivoting during this time of social distancing? Excuse me.
Hi, Ellie. She's a friend of mine.
Oh, okay.
She's an amazing artist, by the way. You can see her all over Brooklyn. She does public murals.
Cool.
So how do I see things pivoting? Well, I think there's a few things that I have been thinking about very specifically, which is about, and this is something that I think in museums always cause a little bit of attention, but I think now people need to think about it more seriously, is what does it mean to engage in small groups? Yeah. And what do things like family units mean? What do things like small communities of people mean? And how do you think about engagement in those ways? The other thing that I think is being more attention is being paid to than ever before is the relationship between online and on-site engagement. As we can start going to public sculpture parks, museums, even those experiences are still mediated during this time. It's not like it used to be, even if you get to go. And so I think that relationship between experience in digital space and experience in real space, how those two connect or where they can intersect with each other, I think is something that's been largely overlooked. I feel like prior to the pandemic, there was a lot of this is online engagement and this is on-site engagement. Right. And they live in these kind of parallel but separate worlds. But we are actually in a hybrid moment right now where people are craving this on-site experience, and we need to think about online engagement as both intersectional to that and distinct at the same time. And I think that has been an interesting challenge, and I've seen some institutions doing different kinds of experiments with that, but I think both scale and hybridity is probably the two areas that I think there's a lot of room for experimentation.
Wonderful. Thank you for that. Alison Pasquezi, who is also one of our alums from the Chautauqua Visual Arts residency program from this past summer. She writes, you point out we are enduring a time of sustained grief and increasing isolation. Part of sharing grief is the ability to empathize with another. I read somewhere, someone wrote, the ability to feel empathy comes basically from one's ability to imagine. There's been much discussion about the lack of basic education and practice, and she says practice in capital letters, in developing imagination. Can you speak to pedagogy in imagination and its ability to engender engagement? And I think that is such a great question.
Yeah, so really like this idea of thinking about the relationship between empathy and imagination. And, you know, as someone who has spent a lot of time talking to people that are from very different backgrounds than me and trying to get them to understand me or me trying to understand them, this idea of being able to imagine a space that's outside of yourself at a really basic level is very critical to that. And and I think that you're right. There hasn't been a lot of education and really practice around what I call, and this is my proposal, around a process of imagination that decenters oneself. And I know that sounds complicated, but I think that is a big key to the process of building empathy, especially among diverse groups. I think that there's this idea that empathy at a basic level is about me being able to feel what you feel. But if we think about the role something like imagination can play, it's actually about moving myself out of that and trying to imagine another space where the person is having an experience that is actually not about centering your feelings in relation to them, but decentering them and saying, actually, in this moment, what I'm feeling needs to be put aside so I can fully embrace what this person is trying to express to me and what they're saying and the emotions that are kind of surrounding those things. Because I think, and this is, not everyone will agree with me, but I think empathy isn't about being able to say, I feel you. I think empathy is about being able to say, I hear what you're feeling. I'm open and I realize that what you're feeling doesn't need to have a relationship to what I'm feeling. I say this really intentionally because I feel like one of the traps we fall into when we talk about things like race, for example, is people's need to say, I understand that. And actually, a lot of the time, the most important thing to say is, I don't understand that. Tell me more. And so this idea of imagination saying, let me put myself outside of myself, I think is a place where a lot of education still needs to take place. And I think we see things like anti-racist training happening in professional environments and all of those things. But what's still quite frankly missing is at a basic educational system, I'm talking about K through 12, learning these skills of empathy and imagination at that early age, recognizing that part of our ability to understand someone else is putting ourselves aside. And that way of thinking and way of being is much more common in communities and cultures that think more collectively about the way that they live their lives and move through the world. And I would say Indian culture is more like that, and something that I've kind of learned in my home. But I think in the United States, there is a big focus on individualism. And so it's sometimes hard to do that decentering work.
So good. Like, oh my God, I'm going to have to replay that again and again and again. I can't thank you enough for that. And Alison asking that question, it is extremely powerful. And thank you for sharing that. So now forgive me, everybody, if I mispronounce your name. I have someone on the chat, Ida Sehovic.
I thought Aida's the artist that I'm working with fast.
Oh, thank you. I hope I pronounced their name okay. And Ida says, how should artists and culture workers negotiate working with organizations/institutions that are going through processes of transformation as they address various forms of power abuse and inequity within their own organizations? Another incredible question. that no pressure. I just know we are going to hear an amazing answer from you.
I don't know if it's going to be amazing, but thank you, Aida, for asking that question. And certainly it's something that I think about a lot. I think there's a few things. I think being in the position of the artist is, in my opinion, always a position of power. And something that I try to tell artists a lot, that, you know what, the organization might be Goliath, but you're David, and you have power in your own right as a creative being in the world. And so I think number one is, and especially I think in this particular moment, recognizing that creatives are really driving the way institutions are trying to figure out how to be right now. Artists are the ones that are saving organizations right now. Look at every organization that people are saying, all right, they're doing all right. It's because of the artists that they are supporting and that are being reflected in their work. So I think that's one thing I will say, that in this particular moment, there's a lot of power. The other thing that I would say is think about who you're working with in the organization. Organizations are not monolithic, and there are different kinds of people with different kind of personalities. And the one thing that I would tell you is to make sure the person that you're working with, you trust. And for better or for worse, it's kind of, I think, on an artist to figure out if they can trust this person. And that might mean spending more time with them. That might mean trying to do a little research on who they are and other projects they've done. But I think all of that is really important, because oftentimes you think of yourself as working with an organization, but you're working with people in that organization, and different curators and different educators and different administrators are going to take you down different paths within that institution. Number three, be aware of, as much as you can, the problems or the challenges that organization is having. Some of them might be things that the work you're doing doesn't have to touch, and other things might be non-negotiable for you. But that is a very personal choice. And the last thing I would say is engage with the system. Make sure you have someone that looks at your contract with you. Make sure that you're getting everything you need to do the work that they are asking you to do or that you're proposing to do. I think we're also in a moment where organizations at a very basic level are trying to think seriously about, okay, if our bread and butter is artists, because we're talking about arts organizations, then how many resources are we putting into that?
Right.
I mean, and I know this is easier said than done, but force organizations to do more. And I would say, and this is where I think a lot about the work that I've done in the field before, which is, about, in some ways, supporting artists and having these tools. There's no one answer, and there will be moments where you have to decide whether or not you can handle working with this organization, no matter how much money they're offering you. That is, as an administrator and an organizer, I've had to make that decision. But I do think that one of the things is to really make sure that you have all the tools that you need to negotiate for yourself, and to negotiate for not just your work, but what you want your work to stand for, regardless of where and what institution it is being supported by.
Love that. One thing that I've talked about, I think someone at Chautauqua, and perhaps it was, and I've forgotten now who that was. I always like to credit people, but I can't recall. This summer, I kept saying that artists work from a place of abundance, not deficit. And so I believe exactly what you're saying is that we hold a lot of powerful attributes within us. I think oftentimes, though, artists don't recognize them. I think that we've also set up the structure that over the years of going towards something, i.e. the marketplace or even a white box to exhibit work, for example, that only it represents, I don't want to say that word, actually, only benefits doesn't benefit 99% of artists in the world today. And so I really loved in your talk where you were saying that art comes in intangible. It could be intangible or tangible. And maybe it's not a place where and I'm paraphrasing now, not a place that you necessarily need to have to show your work, or in a collection, et cetera, et cetera. And I think all the things you're talking about here are attributes of such a wonderful, everything you're talking about is the power of an artist and making those decisions on your own, not giving that power away. Would you say that not having, the Goliath here, and I'm going on, obviously, I will wrap this up, I promise, I'm just excited. The Goliath here is not just academic institutions or otherwise, but it's also like the system that we fall into. Like, we give so much power to the art market. Big question. There are a lot, big quotes. There's a lot of markets. So oftentimes I get a lot of artists who say to me, well, that's not something I should do because I won't be able to get there. How does an artist have that faith to have that power that you're talking about? Because we have contributed to those systems that have failed us.
Well, I think this is the moment. When I talk about a moment of reckoning, this is what I'm talking about, is how even for those of us, including myself, that have had success in this field, part of that success has been benefiting from systems. And I think about this a lot, which is, for me, and I'm going to talk about this from my perspective because I don't think that there's one answer for this. Mm-hmm. One of the things I've thought about a lot is, in all the success that I've been blessed to have and fortunate enough to have, how much of that success is predicated on me working the oppressive system, and how much of that is predicated on me actually pushing up against it?
Yeah.
And that's a complicated question for anybody to, it was complicated for me to even articulate for myself. And it's still something, quite frankly, that I don't want to say I struggle with, but that I still have to move through and recognize that even getting to where I am today, I was complicit in things. And there were invisible people that were being harmed by my success in these systems. And that I cannot erase any of that. That is part of how I've gotten to where I am. And what I try to think about now is what my responsibility is in that. No matter how much or little I have enough to have gotten to this particular place in my career. And so with artists, thinking about one thing that I would say is, when we think about how much we've given to the field, I think we also need to think about what are the ways we've given to the field, and how can we think in more equitable ways, even when we're giving work away for free, who are we giving it to? And when we do that, what are the larger implications of it? Like, for example, I was recently talking to a young woman who's just finished a graduate program and talking about things like internships. And I said to her, look, 20 years ago, in order for me to work in this field, I had to do unpaid internships. Mm-hmm. And maybe still kind of like that now, but it doesn't have to be. And you can ask for more than anyone told me that I could ask for. Mm-hmm. And I think conversations like that, especially for young artists, that they need to be having with more experienced professionals of, you know what, you can do more. Quite frankly, you can do more than I did at your age, because things are changing now. And I am here as a generation past you, or maybe 2 generations past you, to support you in kind of embodying that kind of change. And I think this happens from generation to generation, and it's not a direct answer, but I do think there's values in thinking about lessons learned and really practicing a different kind of self-reflection process that's, again, goes back to what I was saying before, which is about what happens when we decenter ourselves from the way we think about our labor and we think about our place in the field. As artists, we're told to center ourselves all the time, and I think in our creative practice, that is actually very important. But I do think in the field, as part of a community, to think about what that means to me as an artist. What does it mean to be part of a community as an artist? And what is that experience like? And what kind of exchange is that? Not only what am I giving, but what is coming back to me? and thinking about those things in tangible and intangible ways.
Totally. Cultural reciprocity. I think that is fantastic what you just said. Okay, sorry. There's two people now who let's see, who want to, one second. Oh, Aida, I hope I'm pronouncing your name correctly. How should artists and cultural workers...
I think I responded to that one.
Oh, you did? Pardon me. Okay, I'm so sorry. Julia Kwan, thank you, who is an artist also who was part of our cohort this past summer. She says, Sheetal, thank you so much for your talk. Your motivation to meaningfully connect with others resonates with me deeply. I was wondering if you can elaborate a bit more on how you document and present your work after the engagement with and amongst participants, knowing well that the documentation of the work will not be able to fully capture the moments of deep engagement. Great question.
Yeah, I think it's a really good question. And I think it depends on whether we're talking about my artwork or we're talking about like public engagement with organizations. For my artwork, because so much of it is about this kind of like intimate interaction, documentation for me always comes, and it is to me always representational. I never think about documentation of my artwork as a translation of the experience, period. And so that's just a reality I've accepted with my artwork. I don't think all artists think that way, but for me, because so much of it is about that exchange, all I can do is capture moments of that process. There, for me, at least up to this point in my artistic practice, I have not figured out a way to do that that would equate in some way those, you know, the experience of looking at a series of images or a video would equate with the experience of the thing itself. So for my artwork, I'll leave it at that. I think in terms of thinking about public engagement and, you know, people engaging with other artist projects and things like that, I try to use a variety of methodologies, especially when I'm working with an organization where I'm doing something for the first time. So, for example, with the public ambassadors in Times Square, we obviously had photographers come at different times of the day to get that kind of documentation. But I also had my public art ambassadors take daily notes, and they shared stories every single day about people they met, the kinds of conversations they had. And those first-person narratives became a really important part of the archive that I think Times Square over many, many years will value in a particular way. I also think that in the sense of coming from the perspective of organizations, also kind of finding ways for the audience to document their experience from their perspective. How would they articulate or visualize the experience that they just had? And the response wall that I showed just one image of in Times Square, that was the big impetus for it, was actually thinking about, like, what if we weren't generating this documentation? Mm-hmm. What if the documentation was actually being generated by people's experience in a very direct way? And so those are some examples of things that are kind of specific. But I would say overall, when thinking about public engagement, I think there is part of it, we just have to recognize the documentation of a time-based experience is never going to be a full reflection of that experience. And kind of understanding the separation between those two things, I think, can take a lot of pressure off of us to try to document something that, quite frankly, not only can't be documented, but shouldn't be documented, in my opinion. But that's again, my kind of perspective as an educator, thinking about like the sacred nature of intimacy and those kinds of experiences, and being able to demonstrate what's possible visually, but not really trying to like get there in a picture.
I totally think that's great. And like you said, it really, as far as I understand it, and correct me if I'm wrong, it really depends on the artwork, right? It depends on the demand of that. Yeah. And certainly something could perhaps change too if the documentation, if you were documenting it, essentially, like may not stay, I hate to use the word pure, but pure to the work itself, or have any kind of connection to the work itself. Sure. Anyway, so what are your thoughts now as far as could you plug that in for me? Thanks. We're having some technical difficulties here. As far as I was going to ask, how does one right now, and how can you sustain a creative life right now? Like, of course, I'm going to ask you that question of where I'm coming from in my life, and thinking about the work that I've done as an artist, in asking a lot of artists, and so that we can learn from one another. How do you do that? How do you sustain a creative life? And what can artists do right now to help each other?
For me, one of the things I would say is, as a starting point, if you're having a hard time, just keep it simple.
Yes.
These cards that I started writing in March, they weren't about making art. They became something bigger because I followed a very simple impetus I had, which was like, I need to find a way to connect with people. And writing these cards and sending to them makes me feel better too. And so there's that. I also think that because many of us don't have access to the spaces we normally might have access to, and the equipment we don't have, we might not normally have what we normally might have access to. I would say also thinking about what being creative means in the space that you do have access to. Mm-hmm. And don't underestimate the amount of creative satisfaction you can get from doing simple things in your life. It doesn't have to be about producing artwork. It can be about writing in your journal. It can be about having a conversation with somebody. It can be about trying to cook something new. And I know that seems a little bit trite, but honestly, we are all dealing with what I mentioned before, which is this like a certain level of grief, which can for some people be an impetus to be wildly creative, but for others can be really numbing. And not putting, I would say the number one thing I think as a creative is to not put pressure on yourself to do something that may not be possible right now, but to really start at the seat, start at the simplest place you can and let things grow from there. Because I do think that we are just in a moment where there's also the possibility that starting from a very simple place can take you on a process that you might not otherwise be able to have given the moment that we're in.
I think also too, it's about paying attention. Like, I think that little moments and that resonate with you, and you may not, and I wanted to ask you this, would you also recommend, and maybe you might want to share something too that may even be coming from your memoir, what are some little moments of just paying attention where you felt something, didn't quite understand a connection with somebody, but then it flourished in some way? Could it be as simple as that?
I think it can be as simple as that. And actually, during this pandemic, I became buddies with someone that I really don't have very much in common with at all. And we met through kind of happenstance circumstances. Happens that we were neighbors. We ran into each other in the neighborhood early on in the pandemic. And this is probably not someone I would have met in my regular life. And certainly not someone that our level of mutual interest is very little. But during this particular moment in life, we both were people that were living on our own in a neighborhood where we could actually access each other in real life. And I think almost in some ways the disparity of what we had in common, or lack thereof, was what made us have a connection with each other, because we were in a moment where we were able to learn something new about the world through understanding this person that maybe we wouldn't otherwise ever meet. And, it's been really interesting to kind of have that process with this person. And then as reality seeps back in, being like, oh yeah, we don't actually have that much in common, but we had this kind of nice moment together, few months, I guess, not moment. But my point is, in sharing that, is just, I think we are all in a moment where being as open as possible to the unexpected or things that you might not normally be drawn to is really important, because this can be really generative if we're open to realizing that this might be a moment for us to tap into things we might normally never touch.
Yep. I think that is just extraordinary. I'm just going to see if there's any other questions. We could just keep going if you don't mind, or just wait for a few more. I also wanted to say or ask you, as far as a big picture, hopefully we will have a vaccine soon and we'll come to a point where we can go, I wouldn't say back to normal. I don't know if everybody's lives are different. I don't know what that means. But what are some big things for you? What are your aspirations beyond the pandemic, if you will?
Yeah, I mean, I think for me, one of the biggest aspirations I have is having arts organizations rethink their values and how they practice them.
That's great.
I feel like this pandemic has forced us to look at that in a way that we've never had to before, between layoffs and furloughs and all of the kind of really very real and grave economic outcomes of this pandemic has forced us to look at ourselves as a community and not just as individual organizations. But as you mentioned, like we have to reckon with the market's relationship to nonprofit organizations. We have to reckon with corporations' influence on our spaces that are supposed to be open democratic spaces. And honestly, what I would like to see is these big arts organizations take a step back and rethink what it means to be for the public and about the public. Because I feel like, I mean, this is part of the reason I left institutions at large, is because I felt like oftentimes the public got lost in the mission. And I think now arts organizations are in a circumstance where they have to prove why they matter. Mm-hmm. Why are you here? Why should I be donating money to you? You have to answer those questions now. You can't just say art for art's sake or because we have these masterpieces in our collection. You know what? Who cares? What is it that you are here to do for mm-hmm. us and with mm-hmm. us? Mm-hmm. And to me, that is my biggest ambition. And I hope that in the consulting work that I do, I want to be part of those kinds of conversations of how do we change our values? And when we change them on paper, what does that mean in practice?
I can't agree with you more. It's just so well said. So finally, I just want to ask too, can you tell us a little bit about your children's book and your memoir coming out, and when can we be able to read that? Read both
Sure.
of them.
The children's book is a collaboration, and I can't really talk much about it, but I can say that it is related to the art world, and it is kind of a nice combination of thinking about identity politics and creativity. So I'm pretty excited about that, and I'm co-writing it with another professional in the art world. And then the memoir itself is really started out of a desire to write something about the experience of otherness in the United States from my experience as someone who grew up in Kentucky, lived, worked, was educated in Chicago, and now has been here in New York for about 10 years. And the focus of the book is really looking at some of the more subtle experiences of being othered and really thinking about that experience as both durational and impactful in an important way. And a lot of the impetus to really write this story is thinking about and recognizing that this is not just my story. This is an experience millions and millions of men and women of color deal with in the United States on a daily basis and continue to, including myself. And these subtle forms of prejudice and these, what you might call microaggressions, although I don't think there's any such thing as a microaggression, have a long-term impact on how not only we see the world, but how we see ourselves. And so a big part of this is thinking a lot about the way that I came up as a young person, but also the way that I came up in this field, and not having any voices or experiences to look to, and thinking a lot of moments that I was alone in this. And quite frankly, I'm not. And, you know, this book in some ways came out of a lot of conversations with young people who needed to hear someone like me just tell them what it's like to be me, to be a brown girl in the arts, and what that experience is like, and what I had to deal with, and and what things are different and how I navigated that. And that's not about me being an exceptional professional or a mediocre professional. It actually has nothing to do with my talent or skill set. It actually has to do with me being a person, a woman of color in this world and navigating those spaces, and how I did that despite or because of the other kinds of tools that I had in my arsenal in different times in my career. And so I think there's a lot of value to just being able to point to something and say, you know what, that is an experience I can relate to. And if at the very end of the day, whatever I write does that for even a few people, it's really important to me. And my thing is always, or something I always say to myself as I'm working on this book is, you know what, I want it to be slightly different for the next generation. I know I can't change everything, but even giving people a story that they can learn from or say, hey, I get that. Like, that's me too. I'm not the only person dealing with this. That's a big deal. And, you know, the first time in my adult life that happened, in terms, especially in the arts, was a big deal for me. And guess what? You shouldn't have to wait until you're 35 for that to happen. So, yeah, I mean, it's kind of a lofty goal, but I do think that it's something I care about kind of a lot. So.
That's amazing. I'm so excited. I mean, from the beginning when I was had the honor of introducing you and saying that you were born in Buffalo as a first generation Indian American, but then you lived and worked in Chicago, and then after growing up in Kentucky. And I'm just so now curious as to your journey. And I really appreciate your generosity in sharing that and your perspectives. So thank you. And we're looking forward to those forthcoming publications. And I hope you'll stay in touch with us. And I hope that, you know, I cannot guarantee what will happen next year at Chautauqua, but I'm hoping that you will come and visit with us at the Chautauqua Visual Arts next year in person, so that we can follow up this wonderful presentation that you gave this evening. I can't thank you enough for being with us tonight and being a part of now our community, if you will have us. So thank you so much for all that you gave and shared with us. It was really memorable, and I'm really looking forward to going back and looking and listening again, because we will have this posted on our website at art.chq.org. So with that, I also wanted to just have Chip bring on, let me just have him bring on the slide. And I think you know Miguel. So Miguel Luciano, who's following you here, he's going to be next month as a part 2. He came on as many people know this past summer, and we're bringing him on again, and I'm very excited to have him. And I know that you know him, and we teach with him at the School of Visual Arts, and I'm just so excited to have him as well. And this whole program is a part of the virtual porch. I always want to say the open porch. And so if Chip, can you give us this video? Let's just see this. It's called the virtual porch, where we really try to welcome people with all different views and share their stories. And part of what I love about this lecture series and Chautauqua Institution is we are trying the best we can to create space for others. So thank you so much, Sheetal. It was really lovely to see you here. And thank you to everyone who's come tonight, and will also revisit our lecture series. And we look forward to seeing you every month on the second Tuesday of every month, right? Second Tuesday evening of every month at 6:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Thank you, everyone, and good night.